Reason is the capacity for consciously making sense of things, applying logic, establishing and verifying facts, and changing or justifying practices, institutions, and beliefs based on new or existing information. It is closely associated with such characteristically human activities as philosophy, science, language, mathematics, and art, and is normally considered to be a definitive characteristic of human nature. The concept of reason is sometimes referred to as rationality and sometimes as discursive reason, in opposition to intuitive reason. Reason or reasoning is associated with thinking, cognition, and intellect. Reason, like habit or intuition, is one of the ways by which thinking comes from one idea to a related idea. For example, it is the means by which rational beings understand themselves to think about cause and effect, truth and falsehood, and what is good or bad. It is also closely identified with the ability to self-consciously change beliefs, attitudes, traditions, and institutions, and therefore with the capacity for freedom and self-determination. In contrast to reason as an abstract noun, a reason is a consideration which explains or justifies some event, phenomenon or behavior. The field of logic studies ways in which human beings reason through argument. Psychologists and cognitive scientists have attempted to study and explain how people reason, e.g., which cognitive and neural processes are engaged, and how cultural factors affect the inferences that people draw. The field of automated reasoning studies how reasoning may or may not be modeled computationally. Animal psychology considers the question of whether animals other than humans can reason. Etymology and related words. In the English language and other modern European languages, reason, and related words, represent words which have always been used to translate Latin and classical Greek terms in the sense of their philosophical usage. The original Greek term was lambda omicron gamma omicron sigma, logos, the root of the modern English word logic, but also a word which could mean, for example, speech, or explanation, or an account. As a philosophical term, logos was translated in its non-linguistic senses in Latin as ratio. This was originally not just a translation used for philosophy, but was also commonly a translation for logos in the sense of an account of money. French raison is derived directly from Latin, and this is the direct source of the English word reason. The earliest major philosophers to publish in English, such as Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke, also routinely wrote in Latin and French, and compared their terms to Greek, treating the words logos, ratio, raison, and reason as interchangeable. The meaning of the word reason, in senses such as human reason, also overlaps to a large extent with rationality, and the adjective of reason, in philosophical contexts, is normally rational, rather than reasoned, or reasonable. Some philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes, for example, also used the word ratiocination as a synonym for reasoning. Philosophical history. The proposal that reason gives humanity a special position in nature has been argued to be a defining characteristic of Western philosophy and later, Western modern science. Starting with classical Greece, philosophy can be described as a way of life based upon reason, and in the other direction, reason has been one of the major subjects of philosophical discussion since ancient times. Reason is often said to be reflexive, or self-correcting, and the critique of reason has been a persistent theme in philosophy. It has been defined in different ways, at different times, by different thinkers. Classical philosophy. For many classical philosophers, nature was understood teleologically, meaning that every type of thing had a definitive purpose which fit within a natural order that was itself understood to have aims. Perhaps starting with Pythagoras or Heraclitus, the cosmos is even said to have reason. Reason, by this account, is not just one characteristic that humans happen to have, and that influences happiness amongst other characteristics. Reason was considered of higher stature than other characteristics of human nature, such as sociability, because it is something humans share with nature itself. linking an apparently immortal part of the human mind with the divine order of the cosmos itself. Within the human mind or soul, reason was described by Plato as being the natural monarch which should rule over the other parts, such as spiritedness and the emotions. Aristotle, Plato's student, defined human beings as rational animals, emphasizing reason as a characteristic of human nature. He defined the highest human happiness or well-being as a life which is lived consistently, excellently and completely in accordance with reason. The conclusions to be drawn from the discussions of Aristotle and Plato on this matter are amongst the most debated in the history of philosophy. But teleological accounts such as Aristotle's were highly influential for those who attempt to explain reason in a way which is consistent with monotheism and the immortality and divinity of the human soul. For example, in the Neoplatonist account of Plotinus, the cosmos has one soul, which is the seat of all reason, and the souls of all individual humans are part of this soul. Reason is for Plotinus both the provider of form to material things, and the light which brings individual souls back into line with their source. Such Neoplatonist accounts of the rational part of the human soul were standard amongst medieval Islamic philosophers, and under this influence, mainly via Averroes, came to be debated seriously in Europe until well into the Renaissance, and they remain important in Iranian philosophy. Subject-centered reason in early modern philosophy. The early modern era was marked by a number of significant changes in the understanding of reason. Starting in Europe, one of the most important of these changes involved a change in the metaphysical understanding of human beings. Scientists and philosophers began to question the teleological understanding of the world. Nature was no longer assumed to be human-like, with its own aims or reason, and human nature was no longer assumed to work according to anything other than the same laws of nature, which affect inanimate things. This new understanding eventually displaced the previous worldview that derived from a spiritual understanding of the universe. Accordingly, in the 17th century, René Descartes explicitly rejected the traditional notion of humans as rational animals, suggesting instead that they are nothing more than thinking things, along the lines of other things in nature. Any grounds of knowledge outside that understanding was therefore subject to doubt. In his search for a foundation of all possible knowledge, Descartes deliberately decided to throw into doubt all knowledge, except that of the mind itself in the process of thinking. At this time I admit nothing that is not necessarily true. I am therefore precisely nothing but a thinking thing, that is a mind, or intellect, or understanding, or reason, words of whose meanings I was previously ignorant. This eventually became known as epistemological or subject-centered reason, because it is based on the knowing subject, who perceives the rest of the world and itself as a set of objects to be studied, and successfully mastered by applying the knowledge accumulated through such study. Breaking with tradition and many thinkers after him, Descartes explicitly did not divide the incorporeal soul into parts, such as reason and intellect, describing them as one indivisible incorporeal entity. A contemporary of Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, described reason as a broader version of addition and subtraction, which is not limited to numbers. This understanding of reason is sometimes termed calculative reason. Similar to Descartes, Hobbes asserted that no discourse whatsoever can end in absolute knowledge of fact, past or to come, but that sense and memory is absolute knowledge. In the late 17th century, through the 18th century, John Locke and David Hume developed Descartes' line of thought still further. Hume took it in an especially skeptical direction, proposing that there could be no possibility of deducing relationships of cause and effect, and therefore no knowledge is based on reasoning alone, even if it seems otherwise. Hume famously remarks that, "We speak not strictly and philosophically when we talk of the combat of passion and of reason. Reason is, and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. Hume also took his definition of reason to unorthodox extremes by arguing, unlike his predecessors, that human reason is not qualitatively different from either simply conceiving individual ideas, or from judgments associating two ideas, and that reason is nothing but a wonderful and unintelligible instinct in our souls, which carries us along a certain train of ideas, and endows them with particular qualities, according to their particular situations and relations. It followed from this that animals have reason, only much less complex than human reason. In the 18th century, Immanuel Kant attempted to show that Hume was wrong by demonstrating that a transcendental self, or I, was a necessary condition of all experience. Therefore, suggested Kant, on the basis of such a self, it is in fact possible to reason both about the conditions and limits of human knowledge, and so long as these limits are respected, reason can be the vehicle of morality, just as an understanding, substantive and formal reason in the formulation of Kant, who wrote some of the most influential modern treatises on the subject. The great achievement of reason is that it is able to exercise a kind of universal law-making. Kant was able therefore to reformulate the basis of moral, practical, theoretical and aesthetic reasoning, on universal laws. Here practical reasoning is the self-legislating or self-governing formulation of universal norms, and theoretical reasoning the way humans posit universal laws of nature. Under practical reason, the moral autonomy or freedom of human beings depends on their ability to behave according to laws that are given to them by the proper exercise of that reason. This contrasted with earlier forms of morality, which depended on religious understanding and interpretation, or nature for their substance. According to Kant, in a free society each individual must be able to pursue their goals however they see fit, so long as their actions conform to principles given by reason. He formulated such a principle, called the categorical imperative, which would justify an action only if it could be universalized. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. In contrast to Hume then, Kant insists that reason itself has natural ends itself, the solution to the metaphysical problems, especially the discovery of the foundations of morality. Kant claimed that this problem could be solved with his transcendental logic, which unlike normal logic is not just an instrument which can be used indifferently, as it was for Aristotle, but a theoretical science in its own right and the basis of all the others. According to Jürgen Habermas, the substantive unity of reason has dissolved in modern times, such that it can no longer answer the question, how should I live? Instead, the unity of reason has to be strictly formal, or procedural. He thus described reason as a group of three autonomous spheres. Cognitive instrumental reason is the kind of reason employed by the sciences. It is used to observe events, to predict and control outcomes, and to intervene in the world on the basis of its hypotheses. Moral practical reason is what we use to deliberate and discuss issues in the moral and political realm, according to universalizable procedures, and aesthetic reason is typically found in works of art and literature, and encompasses the novel ways of seeing the world and interpreting things that those practices embody. For Habermas, these three spheres are the domain of experts, and therefore need to be mediated with the life world by philosophers. In drawing such a picture of reason, Habermas hoped to demonstrate that the substantive unity of reason, which in pre-modern societies had been able to answer questions about the good life, could be made up for by the unity of reason's formalizable procedures. The Critique of Reason, Hamann, Herder, Kant, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Foucault, Rorty, and many other philosophers have contributed to a debate about what reason means, or ought to mean. Some, like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Rorty, are skeptical about subject-centered, universal, or instrumental reason, and even skeptical toward reason as a whole. Others, including Hegel, believe that it has obscured the importance of intersubjectivity, or spirit, in human life, and attempt to reconstruct a model of what reason should be. Some thinkers, e.g., Foucault, believe there are other forms of reason, neglected but essential to modern life, and to our understanding of what it means to live a life according to reason. In the last several decades, a number of proposals have been made to reorient this critique of reason, or to recognize that other voices, or new departments, of reason. For example, in opposition to subject-centered reason, Habermas has proposed a model of communicative reason that sees it as an essentially cooperative activity, based on the fact of linguistic intersubjectivity. Nicholas Compridis has proposed a widely encompassing view of reason as that ensemble of practices that contributes to the opening and preserving of openness in human affairs, and a focus on reason's possibilities for social change. The philosopher Charles Taylor, influenced by the 20th century German philosopher Martin Heidegger, has proposed that reason ought to include the faculty of disclosure, which is tied to the way we make sense of things in everyday life, as a new department of reason. In the essay, What is Enlightenment?, Michel Foucault proposed a concept of critique based on Kant's distinction between private and public uses of reason. This distinction, as suggested, has two dimensions. Private reason is the reason that is used when an individual is a cog in a machine, or when one has a role to play in society and jobs to do. To be a soldier, to have taxes to pay, to be in charge of a parish, to be a civil servant. Public reason is the reason used when one is reasoning as a reasonable being, when one is reasoning as a member of reasonable humanity. In these circumstances, the use of reason must be free and public.